All right, Chapter 3, starting on page 541. When Truman became president, he replaced almost all of FDR's cabinet. He wanted to revamp the nation's post-war initiatives and their goals. One of the major changes was how we were going to deal with our vets that were coming back home, and he did this through the GI Bill of Rights. This was a $13 billion fund that would basically fund education, vocational training, home loans, business loans, unemployment insurance, as well as medical treatment, etc., etc. This is very, very successful. We even hear about it from time to time today. He worked very hard to make businesses run smoother and better, and in 1947, Congress and Truman together passed the National Security Act, the Presidential Secession Act of 1947 that would prevent multiple runs like Roosevelt had, as well as the 22nd Amendment, which you need to know that for your test. This is what's going to limit all future presidents to 2 terms. In 1946, it created the President's Committee on Civil Rights, and it included whites and blacks. It's a big deal. On this committee, this federally funded committee, you see whites and blacks working together. In 1948, in his State of the Union address, he supported vocally civil rights legislation. He said to secure fully the essential human rights of our citizens. He saw this as something of great importance. In 1948, in July, he barred racial discrimination in hiring federal workers, as well as enforcing the integration of the military. 48 was an election year. The Republicans put Dewey back up again, but the Democrats split, and you see Hubert Humphrey running because he was struggling with a speech regarding human rights. You have the Southern Democrats, also known as the Dixiecrats, electing J. Strom Thurmond, and then the Liberals nominating Henry Walls. Then you've got the regular Democrats who nominated Truman, and Truman still won. This is a huge deal. When the Democratic Party splits, it seems like the votes would end up working out to where the Republicans could win. In Chapter 4, page 548, in January of 1949, Truman says that every segment of our population and every individual has the right to expect from our government a fair deal. Now, this fair deal is something you want to know about for your test. What does this look like? Well, it includes an increase in minimum wage. It increases Social Security. It supports farmers as well as works on housing issues, including rent control, and it also added some money for the TVA. Where was it falling? Well, national health care was something that did not really get addressed here, as well as more money to education, as well as the Civil Rights Bill. So his presidency wasn't perfect. He accomplished a lot, but still lacked in other areas. So back to the Cold War. You have Korea. In World War II, Japan had invaded Korea, and the Soviets drove out the Japanese and pushed them inland up to the 38th parallel. This is where the United States are now stationed, and North Korea is now communist. So they've separated into 2 different countries, North Korea, South Korea, North Korea being communist and South Korea being free. June 1950, North Korea invaded South Korea and sparked this war. Truman sent in the Navy to help keep South Korea from falling. Remember, this is all part of that containment idea. We've got to keep communism at bay. We can't let it push into South Korea. We've got to keep it away. Truman sent the Navy in, and then he went to the UN requesting help protecting the South Koreans. 16 countries answered the call for help, and they came. The U.S. Were leading the pack. We had MacArthur do that. Excuse me. Within the first 3 days, North Korea took South Korea's capital at Seoul. June 29th, MacArthur, who you do need to know for your test, came in, took 2 months to push North Korea back as well as to the Soviet Union. North Korea's president at this point is Kim Il-sung. This name should be somewhat familiar to you as it's a family name. He runs the government in North Korea until 1991, where Kim Jong-il takes presidency, and then Kim Jong-un, which you guys know from the news. January 1950, Stalin agreed to officially and fully support North Korea. Before this point, Stalin's very careful about terminology here. And so in September 9th, Seoul is finally liberated. September 18th, the United States made a surprise attack on North Korean soil. Now, this is kind of interesting. Do make sure that you read this material pretty closely, because the idea was never to push into communist nations. This goes against that containment theory, but this is an exception to that rule. The end of October, North Korea was completely pushed out of South Korea, and on September 11th, Truman had ordered troops into Korea. So they had made the move beforehand. Truman officially pushes them into it, and by the rules of this invasion were very clear to MacArthur. Halt if the Chinese or the Soviet Union enter the fight, and do not, under any circumstances, enter China or the Soviet Union boundary territory. This was his biggest fear. Truman feared that this could escalate into the Third World War. October 14th, Truman and MacArthur met to discuss strategy. MacArthur promised to win fast. Now, what the book kind of mentions but doesn't go too deeply into is these two do not see eye to eye on very much. MacArthur did not hold to the terms, and because Truman had given him the green light to take North Korea, but he ends up pushing those boundaries. October 5th, MacArthur talked to the media and told them that Chinese forces were amassing at the border and requested permission to move in. Cautiously, Truman agreed to some air attacks, but Americans freaked. We've just been through war. We don't want to do this again. By the end of November, MacArthur was engaged fully in an all-out war, which ran into the Chinese army of 250,000. And remember, this was one of the terms of Truman's agreement. November 28th, Truman met with his cabinet to set a plan. He did not want to go to war, but he didn't want to abandon South Korea. He felt like he was in a no-win situation, and on November 30th, he spoke to the press and hinted at using atomic bombs. What's the public do? They freak out. No way, you can't do this. We do not want to go back into this. MacArthur and Truman had a pretty bad relationship, as I mentioned a minute ago. MacArthur didn't mind speaking his mind out against Truman, felt like Truman didn't know what he was talking about. He told Truman there's no substitute for victory, and while a lot of Americans felt like this was such a positive step in the right direction, this is essentially saying no matter what, I will win, and it doesn't matter if I have to go against the president's orders. And on April 11th, 1951, Truman finally solved this problem by firing MacArthur. Most Americans, and certainly Congress, saw this as a misstep. Eventually, MacArthur's all-or-nothing strategy came out, and Truman was ultimately vindicated. Page 555 talks a little bit about new initiatives, some of the efforts regarding this particular time. It's not until September 1951 that the U.S. and Japan officially sign a peace treaty. Chapter 5 talks about the Red Scare in the 20s. It comes back again in 1938 when the U.S. established the House Committee on Un-American Activities, which you do need to know for your test. In 1947, you see it kind of rise back up again under Truman administration. There's a lot of fears that Americans are employing on the federal level communists, and this is really kind of taken aback, certainly by some of the people involved here. Do make sure and read this material, because this is where you're introduced to Joseph McCarthy. He's the one that takes the lead in the Red Menace. He's the one that claimed to have a list of 205 communists working within the State Department, but he never would share the list. I'll share it with the president, but he never did go that far. He basically ran this country in fear for the next 2 years, eventually becoming the Government Operations Committee chair and the head of the Permanent Investigations Subcommittee, where he took the power he had and he abused it on so many levels. He would even pull out books out of embassy libraries that he felt were subversive, and calling on anyone that agreed with those that they were somehow communist. And finally, in 1954, he went too far. He had pushed on military officials, began to target them, and it's when he picked on the Army that finally MacArthur was stood up to. They go into official televised hearings, and MacArthur comes off looking like a bully and a jerk. It took about 5 weeks. He's accused of overreaching, and he's finally finished. In retrospect, he never uncovered a communist threat. He never uncovered a communist agent within the U.S. government, and he trampled all over American civil liberties. In the meantime, you do have the Julius and Ethel Rosenberg situation in June of 1950. Do make sure and read that, because you want to know about them on your test. In Chapter 6, you're introduced to Dwight D. Eisenhower in a different venue. He is now no longer the military expert, but now he has been duped into running for president. He didn't really want to, but he does finally do so. He is a replacement to the Democratic Guard of 20 years. Truman refused to run, so the Democrats put up Adlai Stevenson to run against him. He's moderate, outspoken, anti-communist. But Eisenhower, that's kind of all I have to say in that situation. He's a war hero from World War I and II in Korea. He is the clear victor, and it doesn't take long for everyone else to know that as well. When he came to office in January of 1953, he was the least experienced of the chief executives of the 20th century. He had no real political experience, never really desired it, went to West Point, worked his way all the way up. Matter of fact, really thought pretty close to his retirement age, I'm done, and then all of a sudden he's noticed. MacArthur takes notice of him, puts him in charge, basically presents to him in a short meeting one day his plan for attack, and MacArthur asked him, so what do you think? And Eisenhower said, well, I think it sounds pretty good. Why? And he said, well, you better like it because you're going to run it. And so this is where we see he is the guy that plans the invasions at D-Day. He's a military commander of the European theater at World War II. But he knew his limitations. He appointed smart and responsible people to help him run the government. He had two pretty great terms: limited federal expansion, encouraged private expansion, lowered federal support for farmers, removed wage and price controls, supported Social Security and increased the minimum wage, among other things. He also was a forerunner in atomic energy, felt like that was the wave of the future. He's also best known for the National System of Interstate and Defense Highways Act. He thought that this was important. He had seen the Autobahn when he was over in Europe for the Second World War, was fascinated by it, saw it as a wonderful thing for the United States in case of a nuclear attack, for the evacuation, as well as military support movement. He got great support from the asphalt industry, rubber industry, oil industry, trucking, bus, construction, auto industry, as you might imagine. It was something that really was well supported. What happens as a result of this is a growth and change in culture, which you've got a little bit more of information of that in your book. You also see McDonald's coming into play here. It's just a little restaurant out in California until Ray Kroc discovers it and says, I want to buy this as a franchise, and he grows it into something really amazing. 10 years in, 710 restaurants in 44 states. I think that's remarkable. I don't have that kind of vision or foresight. His foreign politics, he was the first Supreme Commander of NATO before he went into presidency, so he had a long understanding of what European politics looks like. He was anti-communism, very much so bought into the containerism idea. He brought with him John Foster Dulles as a Secretary of State, who was very much so in support of trying to keep the Soviets and the communists in their own portion of the world. This is where you see the growth of SEATO, the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization. You want to know that as both as the Middle East version, METO. In Iran, we see a number of problems with the supporting of a coup of their leader, Mosaddegh. And it's here that their fear of communism moving into Iran comes clear. You also see problems in Egypt in 1953 and in the USSR again. This is where we see the, I mentioned the U-2 incident a little bit earlier, so make sure and read this chapter very clearly. This is also where we see the Soviets send up the first satellite into orbit. In 1958, we finally caught up with them with the Explorer 1 sent into orbit. I'll be back with Chapter 7.